Okay, so I think school funding is like the government gives money to different schools. So, like in South Carolina, elementary schools, most schools get a certain amount, and I honestly don't think it's very fair because these teachers sometimes have to take their own money to buy supplies for their students because they can't afford it. Um, so, yeah.
I think school funding is an issue in our community because there are some districts that receive more money, which is unfair to students.
So to me, school funding is like the government or the school districts distributing money or supplies or technology resources to the different schools amongst the district. And I really don't think it's fair because usually the schools that have more technology and more resources are the schools that have the children that have better test scores and things like that. And I really don't think it's fair because every child essentially isn't getting the same opportunity.
I think school funding is really important and often not fair. School funding is too often tied to things that vary a great deal from one location to the other, like property values, which means that by definition, some schools are better funded, which means they have better facilities, resources, they're able to hire teachers and pay them more money so they get better teachers, and so it just creates a whole lot of inequalities in the schooling experiences that kids have. Especially in this state, we know that there's a lot of variation. If you are lucky enough to go to school in Clemson or in Greenville, you're probably going to have a really, really different experience than someone going to school in Orangeburg or in, I can't think of another place, Jasper County, right? And so if you're out in a rural district where property values are low, you probably have a much lower funded school, which means you just don't have the same resources. So we need to do better with that.
Of course, if teachers got paid more, there would be less of a shortage.
Would South Carolina be in a teacher shortage? I believe that if teachers were paid more, I feel like they would honestly come to work happier and willing to teach their students. I feel like, yes, there would be more teachers, and I feel like students would be coming to class willing to learn because teachers would have a better attitude. So, yeah, I feel like.
No, I don't think there would be as much of a teacher shortage because the people who have the passion but are worried about making a living would actually pursue the career.
Okay, so I think if school districts have higher funding, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are higher performing because it all depends on the teachers and how the teachers teach the kids and if they teach it better.
School districts with higher funding are higher performing than others just because of the simple fact that they have more resources available to them, so they'll be able to do more things and get more things and have better opportunities than others.
I think schools with higher funding do have higher performance rates because the students have technology and resources that help them in their education, whereas somebody that doesn't have those has to catch up because they just don't have the supplies that these other schools do.
I think the obvious answer to that question is yes. With more funding, you can get better materials, better supplies, better teachers, and that really affects how the student learns. With better supplies, students get better grades, better teachers, students get better grades. The more funding that a school has usually means that the students will perform better, and that's why the lower funding schools don't have as good test scores because they don't have enough money for basic needs that the students need.
I would say yes because school districts that have more money typically can get access to better books and better computers and stuff, which allows students to learn different things.
I believe that since funding for schools is mainly based on property taxes, I don't think it's ever going to be equal because the schools that live near the more richer families will have more funding obviously coming into it, and the ones that are in the poorer areas, they'll always have less funding than the other ones.
For every district, because it just depends if it's in a lower poverty-stricken community, it's not, the funding's going to be completely different than a nicer upscale community. It's going to be yeah.
I think that school funding will never be fair as long as it's tied to property tax values of the county that the district is in, because then you get into things talking about distribution of wealth and whether rural or urban cities and towns have a higher property tax value. More people want to live there, so they're going to have more resources for the students, and ergo their funding is going to be a little bit better than a school that might be in a rural area that has lower property values, less amount of people, so they're getting less tax to begin with. So until we address the issue of where funding for schools come from, it's going to be unfair.
So from the discussion we had in class, we know that school funding can come from the federal government, local government, and state government, and that it's different in each state or county. And so this project really helped us conclude that school funding needs to be resolved, and because it's very unfair, there are states that have more money than others, and that gives them more opportunities to succeed and be successful in life.
From the people that we interviewed, we all we got the same answer from most people, that school funding does need to be changed, and it was cool because most people were from different majors and different ages, but all agree that school funding needs to be changed.
Another interesting thing we learned was that most people agreed that schools that have higher funding have a higher performance rate.
And one thing that I thought was very interesting was that a lot of students that were not education majors knew that where school funding comes from, the property taxes, and that was really surprising to us because we didn't think most people would know that. So yeah.